So, okay. So Childcare Now's office is located on the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, and our organization is active on the unceded, treatied, and contested lands and waters across Turtle Island. As a national advocacy organization, Childcare Now respects and affirms the inherent rights, the historical claims, and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands and waters with whom we strive to work with in solidarity. Childcare Now commits to the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of reconciliation. We note in particular call number 12, which calls upon all governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. So again, thank you all for joining. If you have any questions or comments at any point, you can drop them in the chat. We have a couple of Childcare Now staff who are keeping an eye on that chat and will lift up your comments. The purpose for today's session is to give advocates of universal, affordable, high-quality childcare services an opportunity to share perspectives on the current state of childcare and specifically on the unfolding of the Canada-wide early learning childcare system. Morna Ballantyne's going to be speaking today. Some of you may know her. She's the executive director for Childcare Now. She's going to be kicking things off with a short presentation. And then we hope that you will share your perspectives on the challenges that you're seeing or are experiencing with what has also become known in shorthand as the $10 a day childcare. Because there are so many of us who have joined this webinar, which is fantastic, and because our time is limited, we ask that if or when you speak, you limit your comments to just 3 minutes. Some of you may prefer instead to share your views in the chat, and that's great. As I said, we'll be lifting up your comments there as best we can. Please also feel free to ask questions, whether about the content or about the process at any point, again in the chat. And we especially hope that today you'll have the opportunity and you'll feel comfortable to share advice or opinions on what childcare advocates generally, and Childcare Now in particular, should be doing over the next 2 years to make sure that the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system becomes more robust, more accessible and inclusive of all children, and higher quality, of course. In other words, we want to know, what should we be doing to ensure the longevity of the program and protect it from those who do not want to see a publicly funded and managed supply of childcare. So before...
Okay, I'm back. I was thinking as I read the editorial in the National Post today, I don't know if anybody else saw the editorial in the National Post, that the meetings today are incredibly timely. Those of you who didn't have the pleasure of reading it, essentially what the National Post is saying is this would be a good time for the for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party to rethink its support of the federal childcare legislation that was tabled as Bill C-35, and which is actually going to be voted on in the House of Commons this week, we think. It's gone through all the stages, including the Senate. The Senate amended the legislation, and now it goes back to the House of Commons, and the majority party, the Liberals, have decided to support the Senate amendments, which reaffirm and give special attention to the rights of official linguistic minorities in Canada to greater access to early learning and childcare. So the amended bill is going to go back. There's a motion to approve the amendment, and hopefully that legislation will get royal assent soon. But you'll recall when the bill was voted on at third reading in the House of Commons before going on to the Senate, it got unanimous support from every member of Parliament. And in fact, I was watching the vote, and I could see that every member of parliament actually voted in favor. And so the National Post is now calling for reconsideration of that support because of all the problems that the early learning and childcare system is encountering as it unfolds and as it develops. So I'm really glad that we're here to talk about the current situation. And I have a few short slides to help keep me on track and to try to keep my comments limited to about 10 minutes so that we can have as much time as possible to have other voices and get anybody who wants to speak, give them a chance. As Britt said, please limit your comments to just 3 minutes to allow for more people to get to be heard. And also please use the chat, and we'll make sure that the discussion of the chat is shared widely. And this discussion is going to be very helpful to the Board of Childcare Now as we continue to develop our advocacy strategy between now and the next federal election. And I know many of you are also active as advocates provincially and in territories. And I'm sure this discussion will also provide good guidance to that advocacy as well, advocacy in all jurisdictions. So are the slides ready? Can they be put up?
I'll share those right now. Let me know.
That's great. That's terrific.
Seeing the, okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's not the first one.
This, sorry, it jumped ahead there.
Great, thank you. So in contrast to the very pessimistic note set out in the National Post, and that, you know, we've been hearing this through the media a lot in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of attention, a lot said that the system is broken, that the new project is failing. And I want to propose and suggest that, in fact, we've made incredible progress in a very short period of time. So, you know, remember that the federal government decided on a major investment in early learning and childcare and made the promise to build a universal system of high quality, inclusive early learning and childcare only in the spring of 2021. And then it took a year, and that's a very short period of time in federal, provincial, territorial relations to negotiate and agree to funding agreements in each jurisdiction. So really the program has been, the federal national program has been it's only 2 years old. And in 2 years, we've seen fees for licensed childcare dropping dramatically, everywhere by an average of 50%. And now in almost half jurisdictions, fees have been dropped across the board for all age groups to $10 a day. So huge success on that front. The other thing that we've seen is that the federal investment has driven a lot of change in every jurisdiction. We have also, because of this large investment and because the large investment was earmarked to ensure that certain changes happen, we've seen very rapid movement to a primarily publicly funded system. And remember, this has been a key demand of the childcare movement for decades, that we want the system to be publicly funded, not privately funded through parent fees. And that is only, we've always said that it was only once the system was primarily publicly funded that we would be able to see the big improvements in quality, big improvements in compensation, big improvements in access come about once it was publicly funded. That as long as the system is privately funded through parent fees, it would remain inevitably a market system. We've also seen a very firm commitment in all jurisdictions to expansion. We have indeed seen new programs opening. BC just announced not the opening, but announced the commitment of extending its $10 a day program just yesterday or day before. These announcements come frequently. Commitments to increase availability, but centers are actually opening. And there's also been significant expansion in family home childcare as well. We have seen too everywhere across Canada improvements in wages, and in several jurisdictions we've actually seen wage grids implemented. And as I said earlier, we've seen federal legislation. And a huge success, which of course has also been a challenge to the system, is parents want it. They want it badly. They're signing up in record numbers. They're on wait list. And from a parent point of view, it's a huge, huge success. And we need to acknowledge that. And hopefully that is going to translate into parent support for its continuation. If we just move to the next slide, having said that we've seen enormous progress, we've also recognized that we have problems, and there are problems that need to be fixed, and there's a lot more to be done. But importantly, we have solutions to those problems. And there is nothing in any that to say that any of the problems that have surfaced, none of them really challenge the basic concept and the promise of a universal publicly funded system and the advantages of that. But there is more work to be done. For example, we need a lot more work to be done towards the implementation of the very good and very comprehensive Indigenous early learning and childcare frameworks. That is a key piece of work, or many pieces of work that need to be completed and that we need to focus on. The other is that we need sufficient public funding and updated funding formulas. So when we hear of operators saying they cannot continue to operate with current levels of funding, these are very real concerns. They're not made up concerns. And it's because the provinces and the territories, for the most part, although this is uneven across the country, have not been allocating and increasing public funding sufficient to make up for the very high cost of living and the very dramatic price increases that we've experienced in the country over the last few years. But also it has not been sufficient public funding to ensure a much better and higher quality system. And the formulas by which provinces and territories distribute public funds among operators, this is true for centers and it's also true for family home childcare, those formulas are outdated and need to be updated. We also know we are suffering acute, very real workforce shortages, especially shortages of qualified early childhood educators. And to address those shortages, we need some quick fixes like increased compensation, but we also need a comprehensive workforce strategy. And by workforce strategy, what I mean is that we have to make sure that steps and a strategy is developed to expand the workforce, which means that we also have to expand the post-secondary education programs. And then, of course, we also have to significantly increase the compensation so that people will be willing to go and get trained and become qualified, and then, very importantly, graduate and join the workforce, particularly the community-based childcare workforce. We need planned and funded expansion of licensed childcare. There's many, as we were saying, parents want it. Thousands, tens of thousands of children are in wait lists. The time on wait lists is longer, and the numbers on wait lists are much greater. Since the beginning of the building of the Canada-wide system. And so we need expansion, and we particularly need expansion of for-profit and public childcare. And of course, we need equitable access, and the barriers that have been in place for decades and continue to be in place, which are excluding children and families, those need to be brought down. Can we go to the next one? Great. Now, these seem to be big solutions to complex problems. And but we have to remember that we never expected system building to be easy. We always knew it was complex. We always knew that building a system, moving from a market system of early learning and childcare to a public system, was going to take time. It was going to take a lot of good policy. It was going to take money. And it would meet all kinds of opposition. We know that because we have a lot of experience with public system building in Canada. And I just want to remind people that were, for example, when Medicare was first introduced, when public health care insurance, when health insurance was first introduced in Saskatchewan, there were strikes by doctors against the system. There were interests that were being challenged, and those had to be overcome. But over time, we have developed much more robust systems of public education, much more robust systems of public health, and other public services. So we know how to do it. And one of our things we really need to push in the building of a public early learning and childcare system is that we should be relying much more on that experience and on the extensive infrastructure that is already in place to support public systems that exist, for example, within local governments, within school boards, within provincial governments, territorial governments, and of course also federally. So what do? Well, very quickly, one of the things we have to be absolutely firm about is to say, no, we're not going to move backwards. We need to move forwards. So what we mean by not moving backwards is we want increased operational funding, public funding. We do not want increased funding to parents, which is what the editorial in the National Post today was advocating. It's what the Alberta entrepreneurs, childcare entrepreneurs have been advocating for, is no longer moving from increased funding to the providers through operational funding, and instead giving parents funding, either checks in the mail or tax credits to be collected at tax time. We know that doesn't work. We've had that for decades. We saw what happened in Quebec when a change of government moved away from funding, operationally funding the Centre d'études d'enfance, and instead introduced credits, tax credit system for subsidizing the cost of parent fees. We saw in Quebec parent fees go way up. We saw access restricted. We saw quality go down, and we saw huge pressure on the system for the reduction of wages, not for the increase of wages for those who work in the sector. We need very quickly improved compensation. We've seen jurisdictions, as I say, introduce wage grids. We need those across the country. We also need pensions, and we need benefits. We had a huge important breakthrough and success in Nova Scotia with the introduction of a province-wide pension plan for the early childhood education sector. And amazingly, it was a defined benefit pension plan, extending an existing defined benefit plan to include the early childhood education sector. And we also saw in Nova Scotia the introduction of a province-wide benefit plan. And I note that the province of Nova Scotia will be paying the employer, the cost of the pension and benefit premiums, will be paying through increased funding, operational funding, and the employee contributions to those plans are going to be compensated through a wage increase. So we need more of that. And also we need urgently a federal capital finance program to accelerate not-for-profit and public childcare. And I use the word accelerate deliberately. We've seen the housing acceleration program federally yield some important benefits in terms of expanding the availability of not-for-profit and affordable housing. And we need the same for childcare. And a federal budget is in the making, and we have to push hard to make sure that it is included in the next federal budget. Next slide. So what do? We can make those asks of governments. We also have to make some asks of ourselves to be able to counter the attack, this ongoing and growing attack on a public system of early learning and childcare, to be able to actually address the problems that I've identified. And I'm sure you are going to speak to the problems that you have experienced as well. we as a movement have to grow our numbers. We have to get much more visible, and we're going to have to continue steadfastly to advocate for true transformation. No going back, more money into the system, more public funds, and really continue the process so that we really do move away from a market model of supply for early learning and childcare. We're going to have to build the capacity to apply strategic pressure. And this is true on all fronts. And I would suggest that it's also really true on the issue of compensation. The early learning and childcare sector needs to be organized, needs to pressure for increases. We know that organization works. In Ontario, just recently, the education sector won a major award in a further wage increase when the Ontario government's wage controls or wage restraint legislation was overturned by the courts. Importantly, I think we have to absolutely remain positive, united, and we have to emphasize success. We have to stay practical. We have to remember that, yes, there are problems, that we have solutions to the problems. There are public solutions to those problems. And importantly, we have to demand that governments be transparent, that they be accountable, especially now that it is mostly a publicly funded system and a public project. This building of the early learning and childcare is a public project. The system will be a public system. It's one that we're going to constantly have to preserve, protect, expand, make better. But I'm absolutely convinced that we do it. So let's stay on track. Let's continue to move forward. And let's have a discussion now about what more we can do. Thanks very much. Oh, the two questions. Maybe we just go back to that. Two questions that we hope you can focus on in your comments and in interventions. One question is, what do you think advocates should ask of governments right now, particularly in the current period that we're in? And what do you think advocates should be doing between now and the next federal election to protect the promise of a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system? Thank you. Britt, I don't think we have time for a long poll right now. I think we're just going to move right into the discussion.
Sure. So I'll just the poll will still, there's one question that's up there still. If you want to respond to it, you're welcome to. But if you want to move on, Morna, you can still move on.
Okay. Do we have a speakers list? Susan Cake, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I'm joining from on the car, just trying to juggle my own childcare. I'm coming from Alberta, so I hope some of these comments echo throughout. We fundamentally believe that $10 a day can work in Alberta. We think it can work everywhere. We're not getting that messaging for our government, though, but we've come up with kind of 3 things that we need. So it can work if we get all of our levels of government to actually want it to work and to fund it properly. It can work if we are actually supporting our workforce, which we absolutely need to, and we should be doing this. And it can work, if we grow it. We have so many families who are just on the sidelines waiting, and we need to grow it for these families and for these children so that they can access it. We're getting a lot of talk in Alberta about, maybe $10 is just too low. Maybe it needs to be higher. Maybe we just need to change it like this, but we actually don't need to go back at all, especially because we've made such great progress in the steps that we've taken. We don't need to undermine that progress and any potential future progress as well that's to come. We can absolutely do this. And a lot of the issues that we are seeing, at least in Alberta, they are amplifications and spotlights of issues that existed anyways. We have to start somewhere. And unfortunately, building a system, we are starting from the broken pieces that already existed. If we stop now, those pieces don't go away. They just keep going on. We have to put in the hard work to address them now so that 20 years from now, hopefully, we're not still having the exact same conversations. So thank you so much, Morna, for hosting this. And I really am looking forward to hear what others say.
Thanks so much, Susan. Sharon, you're next.
Thanks, Morna. And gosh, Susan, I think that maybe you just spoke for the whole country. That, it's not surprising that here we are just starting out 2024. So just a couple of years into system building that we're seeing these kinds of challenges. And I don't think any of us expected that it was going to be perfect from the get-go. But there are substantial changes. We have made progress. And the fact that waiting lists are so long and that parents are understandably angry and upset that they cannot get spaces of any kind, even 10 a day, just shows that we've made the crisis visible, and we've raised the expectation of families that they should have access to quality, affordable childcare. And so we've made the affordability piece visible. That's what politicians are really front and center about, is addressing the affordability crisis given the cost of living and inflation. And now our job is to help the policymakers and our allies push on the infrastructure building piece. So the fair compensation, including wage grids, the public planning for expansion and not just leaving it to an application-based process, having an operating fund model, which we're piloting here in BC, is actually adequate to deliver quality care with fair wages. And so I feel like it's really easy for media to focus on what isn't working. And that's the narrative that we need to push back on.
Yeah, I'll book you for
There are
4 o'clock
successes,
for
and
opening
we
my
do
daughter's
have
account.
those publicly funded, managed, delivered solutions. And it isn't about the for-profit sector being diminished or us turning away from the for-profit sector. I think that there's room for all existing providers with accountability measures just for everybody across the board, but expansion needs to be focused on not-for-profit, Indigenous, and public. So as you said, Morna, we have the solutions.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sharon. By the way, one of the things that occurred to me, when the latest BC government announcement of the further extension of the $10 a day program, was I don't think that there is a good knowledge outside of BC about what the $10 a day program is, because in other parts of the country, most people understand the $10 a day program as being the same, but just a lower fee. Whereas in BC, the $10 a day program is much more than that. It does transform how the funding how operational funding is handled. It does address issues of working conditions and so forth within those $10 rate programs. So I think that one of the things that would be really great is, with BC's help, that we expand the knowledge, because it is a good example. There are not enough spaces. We know that. We need it. We need it expanded, but it is very different than in other parts of the country. Carolyn, go ahead.
Thanks, Morna. I'm Carolyn Ferns from the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, and I want to speak to some of the folks in Ontario that I know. What childcare programs are going through in Ontario right now is really hard. And what the provincial government has put out in terms of funding guidelines and a cost inflation is not enough. And it's really squeezing childcare programs. What I worry about is that if we're not careful, this, the problems that are facing childcare in Ontario right now are going to be used by those who want to undermine the wide system and the $10 a day plan as evidence that this is a failure. But in truth, what is being experienced right now as Ontario is driven primarily, and I put this into the chat, by the fact that our provincial government has flatlined funding to childcare since they came into office in 2018. And while federal childcare funding has increased exponentially, it's used to cover reductions in parent fees. But childcare programs still need that operational funding from the provincial government. And right now, that provincial funding is lower today than it was when the Ford government was elected, and that's before even adjusting for inflation. So we need to be clear when we're speaking to governments, that we understand the role that the federal government plays and the provincial government plays, and that we expect the province of Ontario to do their job in implementing this program correctly and to the best of their ability to make it a success for families, for childcare programs, and for educators. I can see that Alana also has her hand up, so I'll stop there because I'm sure she's going to speak to the workforce piece, which is, I think really front and center for a lot of us. So thanks so much, folks.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Liz, you're next.
Hi, Dawn. Hi, yes. Thanks very much. Lots to think about with what you've all talked about so far. On the first question about what to be asking for right now, I mean, I think the first thing that crosses my mind, and which I know others have talked about already in other forums, is the need to ask federal and provincial governments for more funding to secure land and public infrastructure for childcare. And in line with this and connected to that also, advocates could be asking for provincial and local governments to partner with local organizations to develop partnerships and create local solutions. And all levels of government could be more engaged with the housing sector to ensure the childcare is guaranteed in new housing projects and grants. That's just touching on the first one. The second one, in terms of what we can do between now and the next federal election, I think it's important to consider what a planned approach to expansion looks like in Canada. Others have mentioned this, and I've only recently returned to Canada after living in another country for a number of years and researching childcare policies in an international context. And one thing that struck me when I returned was not necessarily the end goal of Canada's universal childcare system, but the expectation that it's going to be fully realized within 5 years. I'm inspired by the advocacy movement, but I also think it's worth considering whether we could learn from other countries' more staged approaches to system building. If we look at other countries, we can see that they've grappled with similar challenges. Sweden is often considered a model of best practice. Its system was built it took about 20 years to build its system. It did not happen overnight. They started with 6-year-olds and moved down. In other countries like Portugal and Germany, they are currently as Canada is implementing very bold strategies to try to expand public childcare, and they're also facing these same barriers. They are finding some alternatives, such as starting with different ages. So some starting with older ages and some starting with younger ages, or prioritizing children from disadvantaged backgrounds or children whose parents are in the workforce or studying. I'm not suggesting any of these ideas is going to be perfect for Canada, but rather just that it's important we consider how we can have a planned approach that allows for incremental change to achieve the end goal. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. And I think that two things, just short comments on what you've said, is we actually have some recent and fairly good examples of looking for public lands to expand licensed programs on public lands. I'm thinking of the Waterloo region, which recently decided that as it's scouring the region for lands on which to put affordable housing, it's going to also be looking for lands on which to put licensed childcare. And of course, ideally, maybe the two could go together. As new housing developments are constructed, why not ensure that childcare is part of that? On the phased approach, I think we also do have some examples of governments who have recognized, and of course advocates have always recognized, that it will take more than 5 years, that it's probably a decade's enterprise, and it will constantly have to expand and improve. But there are some examples, of governments starting to look at which populations, which communities to make priorities for expansion. But again, the pressure has to be put on, particularly at the provincial level, to make that happen. And I would suggest at the federal level too. There are action plans being negotiated right now between the federal government and each jurisdiction, except Manitoba, which already has its agreement in place, and it can include the requirement for such detailed expansion plans, and that vulnerable and communities that don't have access. So those are really important points. Thanks, Liz. Alana, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Morna, and thanks for getting us all together. Hopefully my internet everybody is getting a little choppy here and there, so hopefully I am okay. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the workforce and I think, it's been really interesting listening to everyone so far, and I'm hearing some of the things we've been thinking about here in Ontario, right? That this idea of us having to keep sight on the vision, on the values we believe in, and what kind of a system we're trying to build, because there are many ways to resolve the immediate problems we're facing, and a lot of them don't get us any closer to that vision or to those values that we uphold in, what we imagine the system could be. And I think we all know every jurisdiction is facing a workforce crisis 100%. And this workforce crisis pre-existed the Canada-wide system, right? There was a lack of professional wages, a lack of decent work long before the federal government began their sort of new investments in building the system. And I think what we're seeing happen in Ontario, and maybe others are seeing as well, is that the challenges now, while they've become almost more acute because of the Canada-wide system, they pre-existed it, but the responsibility for those is falling at the federal government. People are saying this is because of the Canada-wide system that we have this workforce crisis, or it's worsening because of the Canada-wide system. And I think it's really important that we work against that narrative and we really start to look at what our provinces and territories doing to address these challenges that pre-existed the Canada-wide system, because it is predominantly their responsibility. Not to say we can't also put pressure on the federal government, but I think, we're losing the narrative here about what the Canada-wide system could be. And when I'm hearing about what provinces and territories are doing in the work around the workforce, Ontario's a really good example of probably the worst way to do it, right? Like our colleagues in BC, we've made recommendations for at least $30 to $40 an hour for RACEs, and Ontario came out with a $23.87 wage floor for RACEs. It's just embarrassingly low and completely inadequate. And, they're looking at other solutions like fast track qualification programs and things like that to help address the workforce crisis. But I use this analogy a lot of the leaky bucket, right? We've got all these holes in the bucket and our workforce is just falling out the holes in the bucket. And instead of plugging those holes, which is, wages, working conditions, they're thinking of ways to just put more water in, and it's just going to keep pouring out. And I think if we don't start calling them on that and really making it clear that it's their policy decisions that continue to ensure that we're in a workforce crisis, they're not resolving the workforce crisis, that we're just going to see them take the easiest way out, which again, it might be an attempt to address the most immediate need, but it's never going to get us to the vision of what a Canada-wide system should be. And it's never going to appropriately respect and recognize the work that early childhood educators are doing across Canada. So I'll stop there, but thank you again. Yeah.
Thanks so much for those comments, Alana. That's really key that if we put funding back into the hands of parents and raise fees, that's it for the workforce for improvements. That's going back to what we had. As long as we're back, if they push us back into a situation where any improvements in working conditions and in compensation of the workforce result in higher parent fees, we're not going to get it. It's a lose-lose all around. So it's critical. Martha, I see you're next. I'm going to ask you to hold on. I'm going to ask Rachel to just share a few of the comments that are in the chat to bring those into conversation. And Martha, I want you to think about one of the questions I just saw as I was glancing at the chat. And the question is, and I get this question from journalists all the time, is there any jurisdiction that's doing it really well? Okay, so keep that question in mind if you can. And Rachel, what's going on in the chat?
Yeah, so the chat has been very active, so it's hard to summarize it all at once. But I'm seeing a lot of comments really resonating with Liz's discussion about looking internationally and integrating childcare with discussions of immigration and housing and public planning of schools and providing after-school care. A few points that have been raised in the chat that I haven't heard yet in the on Zoom discussion is not to forget children with disabilities and the inclusion of children with disabilities and the need for a highly qualified, well-compensated and supported workforce to support children with disabilities as well. And that, as much as we've been focusing on the under 6 age set, that we also need to look at providing adequate, affordable, and universal before and after school care as well.
Absolutely. Our movement has always said we need universal, high quality, inclusive early learning and childcare, or childcare for all children up to the age of 12. And the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, and right now the federal funding is directed only for 0 to 5. So that's a big thing we're going to have to take on in the future. Martha, over to you, and then Sheila, I'm going to go to you next. Have I lost Martha?
Hang on.
Okay.
Thanks. So Morna, let me try to answer that question because it's related to what I've been thinking about in any case. So in a funny way, the question about which province is doing it the best is kind of related to the flip side, which is this is a failure. I mean, it's kind of a very naive and kind of simplistic question, and I get it all the time. And I think that what it really does is it puts us in the position of having to be knowledgeable so that we can answer questions like that. And it sort of has to do with the fact that the provinces are not doing this all in the same way. There are pieces of better policy that are being put in place in different provinces. And I think if we, people have mentioned, for example, the Nova Scotia pension plan, some of the financing, which is not covering childcare costs in most provinces, actually isn't at a crisis level in some of the provinces. So I guess what I have been saying is that there are different pieces of a very complicated system that's going to take a while to be put in place, that needs to be done in as coherent a way as possible, that provinces are moving towards it, but some of them are doing it better than others. Everybody is struggling with the workforce issues. They all have pieces of workforce policy, none of them strongly enough, but some better than others. And I think that people are going to have to be up on those things when they speak to the media. I would go further to say that we have to stop being only reactive, but we have to be proactive to putting things out when the media says, this is all unraveling, this is a problem everywhere, and say, no, it isn't. We never expected this to be done in a year. It's been a year. We have a big, important success, which is childcare fees have been reduced across the country in a very tangible and meaningful way. Here are the other parts of what's being done, the system that needs to be put in place. But I think we have to get much more nuanced about it. So I would really push back against a question I always do: which province is the best? Because it's the flip side of this is all garbage, actually. And I think that we really have to start picking out the good parts, continuing to push the provinces and continuing to push the federal government to push the provinces, and also start coming up, like thinking about the kinds of things like how can municipalities who are engaged in the rapid housing program build childcare into their housing programs. There's a lot more that we need to come up with. So I would just push back on that kind of thing. There's no answer to that kind of question from the media.
Okay, Martha, thanks for that. Sheila, I'm going to go to you just on that. On the other hand, maybe one province is doing everything right, but there are things being done well well, maybe not every province, but most provinces is doing at least one or two things well. And it would be really good, I think, if the federal government would actually convene this with activists and with the sector to have a discussion about what is working well, what can we do more of, what can we expand, what we can learn. And that's not at this point happening, at least not in a transparent way. It might be happening in back rooms, but it's not happening openly. And I keep going back to this is a public system. Let us help build it because it is ours and it should belong to us. Sheila, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm in Vancouver at the moment. I'm half the year here and half the year in Ottawa. I'm with the councils, in both councils of women, and if you know, National Council, Ontario Council, Vancouver Council, provincial in both provinces. And we've been pushing for this for many decades. I have to tell you, when she said 2 years into a system building, I did have a chuckle because our councils of women and university women, of course, they're into education and childcare. I'm on several housing committees, and this is all part of a program that we've been pushing for many decades, you know, and if you look up our councils of women on the website, you'll find our resolutions year after year, not specifically childcare, but certainly, you know, related to helping families get their children educated and get housing and combine housing with childcare, combine schools with childcare, and pay less and subsidies and so on. So please realize that this is sort of the latest push, and we really need to list the successes and then work on the ones that aren't, as you have said. And I really appreciate all that I've heard, and I'll come again this afternoon. I'm afraid I was late for this one at a medical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Brenda.
Hi, everyone. I'm on the board of a child care society in BC, and we were selected to be part of BC's new $10 a day test sites, where they're trying a different formula and somewhat different approach. And what we are finding anyway is that there's quite a disconnect between the policymakers, the government implementers of the policy, and what's actually happening for a childcare center. And it's to the point of, like, we are now holding on by a thread of losing all our staff to other centers in our community who have a better funding model than we're seeming able to have on the test site formula, which is going in the opposite direction of the government wanting more childcare spaces. We're still hopeful, but there is this disconnect. And I think the implementers need to actually come and see what's happening in childcare centers in order to really understand the practical aspects of what's being faced. And they also, you know, they get issues raised to them by individual centers. And so one by one, they sort of try to address or pressure into an approach rather than all of the people affected being able to present together a united picture of the reality that's being faced. So I really see that disconnect as a huge issue. And if they were there trying to run this center, how they see they would manage on the formula that they have given. I mean, this is similar to many social issues of the disconnect, but it certainly is what we're experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I don't have anybody else, I don't think, whose hand is up, but it would be really important, I think, to hear from other operators about the kind of issues you're raising. And I'm really curious to know if there are any good experiences of engagement of operators, for example, in the development of appropriate funding formulas. So in every jurisdiction, we know that work is underway. Some are much slower than others around the whole question about what is sufficient funding for both center-based and family-based childcare, and you know, how do we make sure that the needs are being met? Because that definitely is one of the things that's making the new system vulnerable, is that the new system is being blamed for operators not receiving sufficient funding. Now, of course, they never receive sufficient funding. The only way they could is to increase fees, and that would create vacancies because parents could no longer afford the fee increases and so forth. So if somebody can speak to how do we make sure that these funding formulas are appropriate, and what kinds of mechanisms can we be pushing for governments to for that gap that was mentioned between the operators and policymakers. Megan, go ahead.
Hi there. Sorry, my voice is not the greatest today. I'm not sure I can address it exactly the way you worded the question, but I'm a co-president of a cooperative daycare in Ottawa. And prior to joining SWELC, we were pushing through to open up a new room. We had multiple discussions with both the provincial government and the city about, hey, we're open to expand, add more spots. And not once were we told, hey, you might not be approved for those new spots. I even brought it up when I asked, I was like, can we apply with these additional spots, knowing we're hoping to open them in January? They said, no, you can fix that later. And then, so we went through, we spent all the money to get the new room ready. We hired staff, only to find out on December 22nd that any in progress license revision would be kind of paused and halted at that point. And there was no one to talk to because it was December 22nd and everything shut down for the holidays. So now we've gone through a transition of having to lay off some staff because the room they were hired for doesn't exist. Well, we're paying the rent for it because we can't get out of that. But we've had multiple discussions with both the city and the province. And as a co-op, we've even offered both the city and the province to open those spots, but charge the SWELC rate, but not receive funding for it yet. And the city was like, okay, that sounds great. But we had to get approval from the province. And the province was like, no, you can't do that. So rather than let parents access care, affordable care, because we were going to keep the rate the same, they opted not to let that move forward. And we were willing to take the risk of those spots never being accepted into SWELC, simply to kind of offset our losses a bit and provide care to families, because our wait list is too long. Our current families having more children are like, that's basically filling up our spots in and of itself. So we needed the spaces even before SWELC came into play.
Thanks so much, Megan, for sharing that story. What you're describing is exactly the opposite of what we mean when we say planned expansion and transparent processes. So thanks for that. And we only have 3 minutes left to their hour, and I have 4 people who want to speak. So just please keep that in mind, and we'll add a few minutes late. And for those who have to leave on the hour, thanks so much for joining. We're having another webinar. You can come back and join the discussion at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and another one at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, or more appropriately, 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Janet, go ahead. So I'm going to ask you to be as brief as you can. And Susan, I'm going to skip over you because you've spoken, and head off to Christina and Phyllis after that. Janet, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Morna. Thank you for this. I do think you're right about the funding formulas. I do think we need to get ahead of them and actually lay out what will work to ensure the success of the program. In Ontario, they developed a proposed model, and are going to be moving forward in September with this proposed funding model. And it looks very much like the education funding formula, which has been devastating in many ways for education in Ontario. It's based on per pupil enrollment and average wages across the province, so using provincial averages. And I think we need to look at a whole different way to ensure that we recognize regional differences in costs, operating costs, and that we push for adequate wages and benefits that meet parity with the public sector. And I think that's the position in Toronto we want to emphasize as well. We want parity with the municipal workers or other public sector workers. Anyway, that's my comment.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you for raising the funding formula issue. I think we do need to get on it as a priority.
Agreed. More work on that for sure. Christina, go ahead. Christina Schwartz.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to
That's okay.
unmute for a sec. So I operate a licensed home childcare agency, which I feel like we generally are just the quiet ones in the background. But for home childcare providers in Ontario, the wage enhancement daily cap that they can earn is based on what the maximum of what an EC within a kindergarten classroom is allowed to make. And in order to qualify for that full $20 a day wage enhancement or $2 an hour. And the issue with that is RECs within a classroom are not paying for hydro or food or any of these business expenses. And at a time of all-time high inflation, we're capping what individuals are able to make in a day in order to qualify for that wage enhancement. Yet we haven't kept up that funding to support those like massive grocery expenses.
Thank you so much for those. Thanks, Christina. And Phyllis, I'm so sorry to rush you, but we are out of time. Go ahead, Phyllis.
Hi, I just wanted to share a little bit. I am the director of a licensed childcare facility in Manitoba, and our province has funded us to drop our childcare fees and done it in a timely manner. They've also funded a mandatory childcare wage grid that they've also funded that I feel in a very timely manner. They've also supported us with lots of other grants, such as retention of staff and upped our operating grant. They've also done things to help with expansion, like had directors apply and are in the combination with RMs to apply for ready to move buildings so that they can be implemented quite quickly, like within a year, to expand childcare spaces very quickly. So I feel quite supported in our province. Yes, there's still a lot of flaws. Sometimes there's some glitches, and there are problems sometimes at the licensing level to release the funds so that we can have things in place immediately for staffing and for setting up for childcare. However, we are quite well supported here in Manitoba for the time being, with, some exceptions to continuing it and concerns like, when will this stop? Will we have continued success? And is there long-term planning added in there? We don't know about that here.
That's really positive information to share, Phyllis. Thanks for that. I just would make one comment on Manitoba, and that's that a lot of this progress that you've addressed has been made because of federal transfers to the province, that the province itself has not increased its own funding to the same extent that it is not spending its own money, so shall we say, to the extent that it's spending federal dollars, which is fine, but it makes it that much more important that we safeguard the federal program over the next 2 years and through a federal election. I was going to go back and check in the chat. We don't have time for that, but the chat, of course, we were going to read every comment. We've recorded the session. Everything that you have said is going to be taken into account as we expand and develop further our advocacy strategy for the years to come. The interest in this webinar, I think, is an indication that everybody probably knows what's at stake and will work hard to make sure that we protect the progress that has been made and that we push for even more progress. It's imperative that we improve the compensation of the staff, of those who work in the sector. We will not have expanded programs without workforce growth and without better support. And one of the best ways that we can protect this program from accusations of it being weak and ineffective is to make sure that more parents have access to low-fee programs. So that's our challenge ahead. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Like I say, come back if you want to speak more and listen more at 7 o'clock. And please sign up to our e-letter. Join our organization if you can. You don't have to be a member to be part of our list and to take part in events like this. Please join your provincial and local advocacy organizations. That's where a lot of the work is done. Please go to our website and sign our open letter to the federal government, which is calling for two things: that the next federal budget include earmarked federal funds to improve the compensation and working conditions of those who work in the sector, and that the federal government establish a proper capital finance program to support the building of new childcare centers across the country. We need both badly to be able to address the issue of improved access and availability and inclusion. So thanks so much again, and hope to see some of you back, if not later today, at another webinar soon to come. Thank you.